plane built for 7 takes off in Texas with 13 people on board. It never makes it over the trees that are in the way. One of the people on that plane was a guy who had been a Christian for exactly 7 years. In those 7 years, he wrote songs that the church is still singing. He mortgaged his house to give away his albums for free. He confronted the Christian music world aggressively, yet those might not be the most surprising things about him. He's one of the most respected musicians to ever grace the contemporary Christian scene. His name was Keith Green, and his story is way stranger than you probably think. Keith Gordon Green was born on October 21st, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. His parents were Jewish, but they practiced Christian Science. Which, just to be clear for anyone unfamiliar with this, it's a pretty strange religious movement. It was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in the late 1800s that, broadly speaking, treats sickness as this illusion. So you've got a kid being raised in a strange split home, Jewish heritage and old traditions, but Christian Science practice.
The funny thing about Christian Science is kind of like grape nuts. It's not grapes, it's not nuts. You know, it's not Christian, it's not science and scientific. And I was brought up really confused, you know, because I didn't even know I was Jewish till I was about 12 years old. And I was brought up with like the teachings of Jesus plus the teachings of metaphysics and different things, and all kind of mixed together in a blender kind of a thing. And then all my relatives were Jewish, and on the West Coast especially, the Judaism, unless it's Orthodox, is real just, you know, bar mitzvahs, funerals, weddings, and Yom Kippur and Passovers, you know, that's it.
Keith, like many great musicians, had connections to music through his family. His maternal grandfather, George Bennett, founded Jaguar Records in New York. His mother had been like a big band singer who studied voice at Carnegie Hall. His dad also worked in the music industry. And by the time Keith could walk around, his mother noticed that he could match pitch perfectly. When Keith was about 3 or 4 years old, the family packed it all up and they moved to Los Angeles. And it was just a quick drive to Hollywood, and Hollywood was about to become a pretty big deal in Keith's life. Keith's parents made sure that Keith learned guitar and piano very early. He liked piano the most, but here's a detail I kind of love about him. He found classical pieces very boring. So instead of actually learning to read sheet music, he just memorized each piece and then pretended to sight read the music to get away with it. I personally really love this because this is how I also learned piano. So I feel like I kind of understand his mindset around this of just wanting to cut to the chase and enjoy the music. But everything changed when his grandfather, the Jaguar Records guy, sat him down and taught him chords. Just like that, classic music was over for Keith. It was thrown away. And from that moment on, he was writing based on just understanding chord structures. By age 8, he was performing in stage musicals. There's a 1962 review in the Los Angeles Times that calls him a roguish-looking little 8-year-old who stole the show. But by 12, that wasn't really wanted to do. He had already written 40 songs. In 1965, at the age of 11, Keith became the youngest person to ever sign with the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, or ASCAP, for his composition, A Go-Go Getter.
I lost my gun to another guy now, 'cause he's a real go-getter. And all the time he's been telling lies now, and on her heels instead of.
That same year, his father Harvey, acting as his business manager of sorts, signed him to a 5-year contract with Decca Records. Decca wanted to make Keith the next teen idol. They put him in fan magazines like Teen Scene. They got him on the Jack Benny program, the Steve Allen Show, the Joey Bishop Show. And on May 3rd, 1965, he appeared on the game show I've Got a Secret.
Well, 11 is a little bit young to have any real secrets, but we'll make an exception in your case because I happen to know that you do have an exceptional secret. And if you'll whisper to me, we'll let the audience in on it.
Did you have to do something within your own home?
No.
Did you do it inside of any sort of enclosure?
Yes.
Yes, but that's irrelevant.
Irrelevant. Did you do something that is unusual for an 11-year-old boy to do?
You are looking at a young man of only 11 who has just signed a 5-year recording contract as a rock and roll singer.
His debut song was called Cheese and Crackers, which is hilariously different as a title from the B-side of that, which was I Want to Hurt You. So at this point, Keith is well on his way to becoming a household child star name, but then the success train derails.
One bad apple don't spoil the whole bunch, girl.
Oh, give it one more try before you
The Osmonds happen. Donny Osmond happened. America's girls fixed their attention on a different fella, and Keith and his 40 songs got eclipsed, completely forgotten and dropped. The teen idol idea fizzled out before it ever really caught fire. Decca cut him from their contract and he bounced through a few smaller labels, but by the age 14, Keith felt like a has-been. I want you to imagine being a 14-year-old and feeling like you'd already been at the pinnacle of your career and that you just got used up. And you might start making some pretty bad decisions. In 1968, at the age of 15, Keith ran away from home and he hit the road looking for two things: music and spiritual truth of some sort. He found one of them very quickly, the wrong one though. The late 60s were a pretty strange time in Southern California. The hippie movement was at its height, the Vietnam War was going down, the Manson family murders were all over the news and had just happened. The Beatles had gone to India and they had learned all sorts of new age stuff from different mentors there. Drugs were everywhere, and Eastern mysticism was being repackaged for American teenagers to consume. Keith at this point dives really hard into marijuana usage, LSD, and other psychedelics, not just to get the high, but because he really believed the narrative of them leading to a spiritual encounter or breakthrough of some sort. He read all about Eastern religions and tried just about every framework that he could find for making sense of why he was here and what he was supposed to do about it.
And so you were just always searching.
Like crazy. Yeah. And I searched with my whole heart. And in all the Eastern religions and all the cults and all the world religions, they always gave some credit to Jesus Christ. The Muslims say that he was a prophet. The Christians say that he was an incarnation of the Godhead in his age. Yogananda and all these different Eastern teachers said that he had Christ consciousness. You know, they always use words like Christ consciousness, Christ this, Jesus that. The Buddhists would even say he was a Buddha. You know, he was another incarnation of God like Buddha was. And in all my searchings, I saw that all these people were pointing to Jesus. They're going, well, yeah, Jesus is one of the ways, but we're one of the ways. And they wouldn't all agree on anything except that Jesus was one of the ways. And then I looked into the Bible where he says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one gets to the Father but by me. So they all gave him credit and he only gave himself credit. And I went, well, that kind of eliminates everybody. They all say he's cool.
Now, while all of this is happening, Keith played piano and he sang in clubs around Los Angeles. One of his regular gigs was the Blah Blah Cafe. It's a really famous spot whose stage had hosted plenty of famous comedians and musicians. So imagine this guy who feels like he's already washed up, playing in the background as you meet people that are just getting started in their careers. In 1972, he met Melody Steiner. Melody was also Jewish and also a musician and also a seeker of truth who had not found some answers. They were inseparable from the start, and they got married on Christmas Day. In 1973, they were just trying every spiritual path that they could find together. Melody would later describe these years as a period of cycling through philosophies the way other couples cycle through apartments. In 1974, Keith signed with CBS as a staff songwriter, and he and Melody started co-writing as a team. By 1975, Keith was 21 years old, married, employed in the music industry, and absolutely miserable. He hated life. And then a friend of his, a singer-songwriter named Randy Stonehill, invited Keith and Melody to a Bible study on a Friday night. They asked a ton of questions, and that night in 1975, Keith became a believer in Jesus. Keith later said that he had been lost in a fantasy until God's love broke through to him. And that phrase, "your love broke through," would soon show up in one of the most beloved songs that he ever wrote. A week later, Melody made that same decision for herself fully and in her own terms. Keith's friend Randy Stonehill described it later in a characteristically blunt term. His zeal quite often got ahead of his emotional and spiritual maturity, which is the kindest possible way to say that Keith Green, having found Jesus immediately, turned into one of the most blunt and unrelenting evangelists that we had ever seen.
If it wasn't for hypocrisy, I would have become a Christian 5 years before that. But all the Christians I knew were so busy getting blessed. They were so busy going to functions and concerts and listening to their Christian albums and going to their fundraising dinners and all these things. But the Jehovah's Witnesses would come to my door and spend 4 or 5 hours with me. I didn't find a Christian that had that time for me.
Once he was on the inside, he wasn't going to be one of the people with a double life. Here's where Keith's story gets even weirder. Most musicians that we see right now that have some sort of a conversion might change a little bit. They might thank God in their speeches now. They stop doing drugs, or they decide to collaborate with another artist on a gospel song. Keith did something way different. Within months of becoming a Christian, Keith and Melody started inviting people just into their home to live there. The first long-term guest was Randy Stonehill, who was going through a rough patch, and so they brought him in to stay. Then a young single mother named Karen showed up with her 6-month-old daughter, Dawn. Then a 40-year-old woman dealing with depression. Then suddenly a heroin addict, then runaways, then prostitutes trying to leave abuse, pregnant teenagers with nowhere to go. The neighbors in the Woodland Hills, a cushy suburb of LA, were less than happy about this. So imagine being a quiet middle-class family in the 70s and suddenly the house next door has like over 50 people living inside of it. Some of which are recovering addicts that you normally wouldn't want to be around. The neighbors complained and the Greens just didn't stop. Instead, they bought the house next door and they rented 5 more on the same block.
20 young people, and take people in off the streets, and we go into prisons and go into ghettos and do different things that I really feel is lacking. You know, it's real easy to be a Christian recording artist and a Christian concert artist and all these things, but it's when I go home is when it really gets to be, you know, down to the bottom line.
They eventually had about 7 properties that were absolutely packed with people in recovery of some sort. And the locals took to calling it the Greenhouse, which is a pretty clever name. This was the prototype of what would become Last Days Ministries. Their belief was that if you said you believed in Jesus, you ought to actually live like that. Most people go through their life sectioning off parts of their lives, their career, their success, and giving a small piece of the pie to God. Keith handed over the whole pie. You know, you should take a second and subscribe to the channel because I'm working on a new series that you'll probably like if you like this video and have liked others that I've done recently. Thanks for watching. Okay, let's go. In 1976, Keith met a record executive named Billy Ray Hearn, who had recently founded Sparrow Records. Hearn went to one of Keith's small church concerts, and he could barely get in the door because the place was so jam-packed.
So many times I've tried to tell you, but I don't think you've been listening. There's nothing I want to try and sell you, 'cause his love is free. You're so proud of saying.
He told the story years later. He had to crawl down the aisle and climb past a bunch of kids that were sitting on the floor and watch this super hairy guy banging away on an old piano that didn't even sound that good. Hearn went up after the show and offered Keith a contract. Keith said, "Well, I can't because I actually told Pat Boone that I'd sign with his label." Hearn at this point was probably internally screaming, and he said, "You haven't actually signed it yet, right? Can we have breakfast?" The next morning, Hearn and Keith met and they sketched out a record deal on the back of a napkin. Keith's first solo album, For Him Who Has Ears to Hear, came out in May 1977. It featured the song Your Love Broke Through, which has since become an absolute classic of his and one of my favorites.
Until today, when you pulled away the clouds that hung like curtains on my eyes. been blind all these wasted years, and I thought I was so wise, but then you took me by surprise. Like waking up from the longest dream.
The album also had You Put This Love in My Heart and a bunch of other deeply personal, piano-driven, gospel-saturated songs that vocally sounded a lot like Carl Wilson meets Elton John meets Billy Joel, and it was a hit.
I tried but could not refuse. You gave me no time to choose. You put this love in my heart. I wanna know where the bad feelings go.
Years later, the magazine CCM would rank it the 5th greatest album in the history of Christian music. Then came the second album, No Compromise. The title was lifted from a line in the song Melody wrote called Make My Life a Prayer.
There you are. I'm gonna talk for a second. I bet you got the keyboard. There you are. Hi. I really believe there's a lot of church kids watching today. If you're home and you're my mother won't let me watch Leave It to Beaver, so I turned on 100 Huntley Street, and here we are, and you're watching me, and you're going, where'd that guy get that hair from? I mean, didn't he wash his face today? And you're going, I didn't think that people could go to heaven that looked like that, And I just really want to share this with you because I know that you've been turned off a lot by the hypocrisy around you. And I want to let you know that Jesus Christ is no hypocrite. I might be ashamed of what people have done in his name. I might be ashamed of even what his people have done sometimes, but I've never been ashamed of Jesus.
Make my life a prayer to you. I want to do what you want me to. No empty words and no white lies. No token prayers, no compromise.
Melody later said that No Compromise captured the absolute heart of what Keith was wanting to say to other Christians. It was intentional, and it was a scolding album. It included Asleep in the Light, a song that if you've ever sat on a comfortable American church pew, it will absolutely demolish you. It's basically a beatdown of comfortable Christianity set to music. And this is also when Keith started becoming more and more popular. Mainstream television wanted him again suddenly. Talk show radio wanted him. Keith was breaking out of the Christian music circles and getting the attention from the secular music industry. He could have had everything that he wanted when he was 14 years old and told that he was a has-been. But again, Keith did something different before it all ended suddenly. In 1979, after the massive takeoff of No Compromise, Keith went on to Sparrow Records and he asked to be released from his contract. He didn't feel good about charging money for his music anymore. Christian music at this point was becoming a genuine industry. Bookstores were stocking cassettes and advertising, and concert tours were filling up stadiums and arenas and selling out. Money was just simply flowing in and flooding. And instead he looked at the whole thing and said, I think I hate this. I'm ministering and a pastor doesn't charge for admission to a church, so why should I charge admission to a concert? Sparrow, to their credit, let him go. Billy Ray Hearn agreed to release Keith from the contract through Sparrow, but he retained half of the publishing and international distribution. Keith and Melody then mortgaged their house to finance his next album themselves. They started their own label and named it, with that now trademark green humor, Pretty Good Records. The album was called So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. In that title track, Keith sings in the middle of the song an absolutely demented improvised list of manna waffles,
Manna bagels, fillet of manna.
Mind you, this is the same album, by the way, that features Bob Dylan playing harmonica on the song I Pledge My Head to Heaven. He and Keith had become friends and mutual admirers of each other's work, and Dylan reportedly told Keith while they were tracking those harmonica parts that the album For Him Who Has Ears to Hear was one of his favorite albums of all time. Which is a really crazy story to hear because half the time you don't really know what Bob Dylan is thinking or what he thinks of things, but many people repeat that story. The album was released in 1980. Now, how does a guy like Keith Green sell it? Well, he doesn't. He shipped it to anyone who asked, and he asked them to send whatever they could afford. If they could afford nothing, he sent them the album for free anyway. By May of 1982, Keith had shipped more than 200,000 copies of So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. 61,000 went for free, paid by a guy who had mortgaged his own house. When Keith's albums were eventually carried in Christian bookstores, his policy became that for every cassette purchased, the buyer got a second cassette free of charge to give away to somebody else who needed it. Keith, whether he was a theological genius or not, believed everything he said. He found it important and he practiced what he preached. There wasn't some secret mansion or going out and buying the most expensive clothes and paying for the most advertising on the planet. This was not a prosperity gospel thing. It was actual conviction. In 1979, Keith and Melody and the entire greenhouse community decided to leave their spot and they moved to a 9-acre property in Garden Valley, Texas, about 9 miles west of the small town of Lindale. The Greens then called it Last Days Ministries. Last Days Ministries grew extremely fast. By the early 1980s, they had a printing press and they were cranking out free monthly newsletters that reached tens of thousands of households. They had pamphlets and tracts on dozens of subjects. They had teaching tapes that they would send out. They had a 10-week residential program where young adults from all over the country would come to live, work, study, and get pushed pretty hard on questions of personal commitment. By the time of the coming tragedy, more than 140 people lived and worked at the property full time. Now with this, Keith was also kind of an intense personality. He had what one biographer called a John the Baptist temperament. He was known to be pretty abrasive due to his devotion, and people who lived at Last Days have over the years given a range of accounts about their experience. Many described it as the most formative spiritual season of their lives, but others had a different reaction. They had concerns about pressure tactics and this all-consuming community life that blurred some lines of what they felt was appropriate. That same uncompromising standard that he held for himself, he pinned onto everyone else. Now, Keith's theology was imperfect. He associated with a lot of figures that maybe people wouldn't be as comfortable with today. Some of his closest mentors were really aggressive revivalist preachers, particularly a man named Leonard Ravenhill, who eventually lived near the ranch.
Of course, other people couldn't keep up with him. They thought maybe he wasn't mature enough, in one sense, for leadership. You know, want everybody to jump up to his level, which you can't do any more than I could jump up now to the level of an Olympic runner. I used to run, I'd like to run, but I can't. I'm glad even to walk. But he was like that. I mean, he saw eternal things. And if they weren't clear to you, he couldn't understand your stupidity. He couldn't understand why you're not leaping and, you know.
What you can say is that Keith was sincere. He believed every single word, and he was prepared to give up whatever he needed to for the end goal. So let's take a second and let's talk about the music itself that he had released before it all ended. His songs broadly fall into 3 categories. Category 1, calmer songs that are more worshipful, sung directly to God. The big example is, "O Lord, You Are Beautiful." The whole song is essentially a believer asking for steadier focus and asking for the heart to be in the right place. And then there's the very popular song, "There Is a Redeemer," which was actually written by Melody. This song has probably become the most sung composition to come out of his entire catalog. Now, category 2 of the songs is a different story. Very confrontational, theological, sometimes funny and sarcastic, sometimes very angry songs that are aimed at Christians. "Asleep in the Light," "The Sheep and the Goats," "So You Want to Go Back to Egypt." He once said, "I've never tried to be controversial. The truth is controversial enough." Now, category 3 are the songs that are about how Jesus changed his own life. "Your Love Broke Through" is a cornerstone here. It is perfect. It is a phenomenal song. And so is Grace by Which I Stand. They tend to be where Keith is at his most musically complicated and in his pocket. And to me, these songs feel the most genuine because they are feeling like his train of thought put onto paper and put to music. Songs for the Shepherd released in 1982, 3 months before the upcoming tragedy. Keith Green and Melody had 3 children by the summer of 1982. Josiah, 3 years old, Bethany, 2.5, and Rebecca, who was just 1. Melody was also 6 weeks pregnant with their 4th child, who would be named Rachel. In the spring of 1982, Keith and Melody had taken a trip to Europe, and they'd come back super excited for international missions and church planting. That summer, a couple visited them, John and Dee Dee Smalley. They were church planners and they had 6 kids, so they came to talk with Keith and Melody about ministry partnership. On the evening of July 28, 1982, Keith offered to take the visiting family up in a small plane to give them an aerial tour of the property and the beautiful Texas landscape, just for fun.
I just remember that day, it was like unusually hot. And Keith came running down, just busting through the doors, going, "Hey, we're gonna go up in the plane now," and he wanted me to come with him. I said, "Nah, I don't wanna go. You guys go and see when you get back." And then Keith and I had this really odd conversation. Out of nowhere, "Well, if I don't come back," he said, "raise Rebecca to be a woman of God." And I said, "Well, okay." And so then I started thinking, well, I'm pregnant. So I said, "Well, if you don't come back, if I have a boy, do you want me to name him after you?" Suddenly I had to know that. And he goes, "No, it's fine, you don't need to." And so they just drove off.
The plane was a 1973 Cessna 414. Pretty standard twin engine, typically configured for 6 to 7 passengers. Last Days had recently leased it, and the pilot was Don Burmeister, a former United States Marine aviator. Burmeister had only very recently completed a check ride to remove a restriction from his pilot's license. Before that, he had been certified for limited types of aircrafts, not twin-engine planes like the Cessna 414. The flight examiner who signed off on Burmeister's check ride was decertified by the FAA the very next month due to a documented history of incomplete or substandard checks. Also, the insurance carrier had required that Burmeister log over 1,000 hours of flying time. He also needed to attend a Cessna training course and log more hours before he could even act as the pilot for that aircraft. Burmeister didn't meet all those requirements before July. That evening, the plane was loaded with 12 passengers. Keith, his children Josiah and Bethany, and the entire Smalley family of 8, plus Burmeister, the pilot. So 13 people total in a plane made for 7 max. It was later determined that the aircraft was overloaded by an estimated 445 pounds, and the center of gravity was thrown off as a result.
Maybe Don equated 3 small children to be equal to 1 adult. But regardless, there weren't enough seats or seatbelts. And with full tanks, he was 450 pounds overweight, and the center of gravity was over 4 inches aft of the limit. But the reports were that the plane, on rotation and for the duration of the short flight, was in that nose-high attitude. And for those non-pilots, here's the deal. It's human nature that on takeoff and something isn't right, you want to raise that nose away from the earth. Something's wrong. I got to get away from the ground. But airplanes can stall at any speed, and you hasten the stall if you keep increasing that angle of attack.
Around 7:20 in the evening, an hour before sunset, the Cessna lifted off the private airstrip on the property, and according to those that saw it, the plane appeared to be struggling for altitude almost immediately, and it began to plummet. About a mile from the runway, it crashed right into the trees. And there were tragically no survivors. Keith was 28 years old, Josiah was 3, Bethany was 2, and Melody was at home with 1-year-old Rebecca. Melody told reporters in the days after the crash while still pregnant with Rachel, "I feel that through this many others will catch the vision and the burden of Keith's work. People can't look to Keith now because he's gone. So if they ask who's going to do the work, they'll see that they will. I've seen some people saying that Keith died because he was trying to be overly generous and give a good experience to a visiting family. But at the end of the day, this feels like a simple lapse in judgment combined with a pilot who should have made the call and said no. Keith, Josiah, and Bethany are all buried together in a small Lindale cemetery. Their headstone reads, "Gone to be with Jesus."
All my life I've been searching for that crazy missing part, and with one touch, Lord, you rolled away the stone that held my heart. And now I see that the answer was as easy as just asking you in. And I am so sure I could never doubt your gentle touch again. It's like the power of the wind.
Keith died with songs unfinished. After his death, Melody and producer Bill Maxwell pieced together 2 more albums from material that Keith had been working on. The Prodigal Son in 1983 and Jesus Commands Us to Go in 1984. Both of them feature songs that had been intended for full studio treatment and recording, but instead went out as demos and rough takes. Even in their raw form, they are some of his most beloved work to this day. This reminds me of how Rich Mullins' legacy was cemented with the Jesus album. If you haven't heard Rich's story, I have a video out about that as well. So what now? What's Keith's legacy? Well, 2 things happened. The ministry survived, sort of, and the music went insane. Melody Green took the lead on Last Days Ministries and ran it for the next 14 years. In 1996, she announced that the ministry would be closing in its original form, saying, "For certain ministries, there are seasons. Any ministry that has been born for a specific time of anointing should only continue to exist for the season God appointed it for." She has since restarted Last Days as a primarily online thing, distributing Keith's writings and music for free. Melody has continued to write and minister all over the world. The Texas property was eventually taken over by Teen Mania Ministries. This was a youth ministry founded by Ron Luce that ran for many years. And Teen Mania itself eventually closed in 2015 amid its own set of controversies, but that's a different story. Keith was inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame on November 27, 2001. In 2006, he was awarded the ASCAP Crescendo Award. In October of 2025, the Christian and Gospel Music Museum opened in Nashville, and they honored Keith with multiple permanent displays. Every generation of Christian musicians seems to cite Keith as some form of an influence. All of the albums hold up. The melodies hold up. He was sincere on a level that almost nobody is right now. The mortgaging off of his house to give albums away for free is not a marketing stunt. After over 40 years, the records are still in print. He was, by all evidence, the real thing. A lot of y'all asked me to do a cover. I wasn't planning to, but I'm in the edit and I thought, you know what, I'll give you something here at the end. I find it hard to believe someone like you care for me. You put this love in my heart. I tried but could not refuse. You gave me no time to choose. You put this love in my heart. That's what it is.